Hello, everyone. Welcome to another casual chat with Rupert August and Co. Would everyone like to introduce themselves quickly?
I am the first of the co, Henry.
I'm living in the basement, Simon.
Kurtz.
All right, very good. So today we will be talking about, well, in a hopefully slightly more brief fashion than we've been getting used to, we'll be talking about community and the general trajectories of community and perhaps what might be assailing it. Hopefully everyone's brought something that they'd like to talk about in this regard more specifically, but if not, we can just kind of, riff about the topic. It's something that's come into our periphery in other areas at various times, and I'm sure we'll go back to there. We've been kind of generating a little bit of an overall theme of talking about things in terms of aristocracies, so that'll probably be what I default to, but yes. So, how would we like to start us off?
I mean, I guess I was the one who proposed this topic, and my thought process, anyway, is something along the lines of, I guess it was more thinking about how, like, the internet, social media, and things like that really seem to affect people's ability to somewhat function in a way, and in, like, a communal sense, because while I understand that the internet is obviously the internet and Twitter and Facebook are not reality, they do kind of inform reality to an extent, assuming no one disagrees with me on that.
No, I wouldn't disagree, certainly. So our perception of the world is very heavily shaped by what we see going on in places like Twitter and Facebook and whatever, and that's potentially corrosive, particularly in the case of something like Facebook, which kind of engenders a certain attitude of continually comparing yourself against the achievements or the best points that they decide to show you of your peers, and that's probably unhealthy for one's self-esteem. So it's been reported in the past.
Yeah, in an attempt to get something for this podcast, I was like browsing a few studies, and it's very difficult because, of course, the conclusion seems to always be the same, which is just everything is inconclusive. There's too many working parts to understand. But I know that for one thing that I saw that was a very recurring stat was, funny enough, the self-esteem of women when they go on Instagram, because apparently it just takes an absolute pounding when they go on Instagram for some reason.
Well, that's probably got something to do with the photoshopping that happens, or the general image adjustment, and the idea that perhaps women seek out more sort of beauty and makeup, and to be entirely stereotypical. Those are the kind of channels and Instagram channels that they'd be looking out and trying to get more content from, so that would perhaps negatively affect their sort of self-view and view of their own beauty.
Yeah, it's like that's an example I can give you, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So some stuff that I've seen, although I couldn't necessarily give you a proper citation off the top of my head, is how it affects teenagers and such, and adolescents generally, because that's a very formative time, people trying to figure out where they are in the world and who they are in the world. And so for example, if it may be more complicated than this, but let's say that it comes, partially from the level of society and partially from the level of family, then if the society element of that is coming from very stilted sources like Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, etc., then that's going to be giving people a very skewed perspective on what their place in the world is, and how valuable they are inside it.
Okay, I guess to maybe get this all more broad and general, why don't we just go around the table and maybe ask, do we all agree that it has an influence, and do we think it's negative or positive at the moment? So, no, obviously, I think me and Rupert just said we think it's affecting things, but we also think it's negative. What do Henry and Kurtz have to say?
I definitely agree with you guys that social media definitely does have an effect on people, and from what I've seen, again, I can't cite anything off the top of my head, but from what I've seen, it certainly seems to have a negative impact on people.
Well, actually, before we move on quickly, do you want to just quickly go into that as to what kind of negative impact it's been having? Sorry to cut you off, Henry, but I think that'd be interesting to jump on before we move straight on from that.
Yeah, okay. It is, as you've said, that it's encouraging this comparison between your own life and the lives of the people that you see around you, and they are only posting whatever what they want the world to see. They are. I hate it because it is a Facebook or like Instagram meme, but it's like, oh man, don't compare your behind the scenes to their what was it? God damn it, I've forgotten how to end that.
Well, to their best version of themselves.
Yeah, to their like best their highlights reel. That's it. But yeah, you see, like, for example, your friends, you see them posting things about, oh, I've got this new job, I got this new car, I'm doing these interesting things. It's giving you an unrealistic view of what their lives are like, and then by consequence, you've got unrealistic expectations about your own life.
I do wonder then. So that just brought a rather amusing thought. I wonder if when these things are conducted on a more local level, if there might be some kind of positive influence then to counteract that version, where people are comparing themselves against the best version of other people, whether things like, rumours and personality smears that happen behind the scenes, particularly among women, whether that has a mediating effect on that, or, like tempers that a little bit, because you're getting to see some of the perhaps even exaggerated, but nonetheless the dirty laundry that other people have in their lives, which can temper whatever rosy picture that you're getting elsewhere.
I think so to get my point of view out, I as a whole agree with what's been said so far. I think that it definitely can have a negative impact by comparing yourself to other people's highlight reels. But the things that I would add there are that it's not necessarily everyone. Like, I don't think any of us personally are the type of people that are going on Facebook and scrolling through and envying at our classmates. Is that the right word? Right way around? Being jealous of our classmates? Can't remember which one.
Yeah, that'd be the right term.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I don't think it's definitely a bad thing. I think it's the type of person that definitely needs to one up other people, I guess. They're the type of that's the type of person that would have potentially have a bad experience on those sort of platforms. But I do think, by and large, people, at least people our age, would just sort of ignore it. And the other thing I'd add is, mainly sort of to play devil's advocate, is that there are other positive aspects that it would bring, otherwise people wouldn't use it. So the main one that comes to mind, obviously, is, say, for example, when people are separated or isolating, perhaps, it allows people to have that connection to their peers, or to message people and stay in contact, and just sort of get to know what their friends are doing in their lives, rather than it necessarily being a bad impact of look how exciting their lives are in comparison to my boring life, or it's more, I'm keeping up with what friends are doing. We can talk about that later, or we can, I feel involved in the process.
Yeah, that's definitely a valid part, and I was just going to suggest actually that somebody make the devil's advocate position, because it's not all bad. There are certainly good things you can find in there, and there's something to be said as well for the ability for people to be exposed to a greater degree of information generally, even if it is slightly manipulated. There's some amount of utility that could arguably be gained from just having the opportunity to see more points of view and things.
Yeah, I think it depends on the person that you are, and depends on what platforms you're on. But I think it's dangerous to just assume that everyone is a jealous middle-aged woman.
Yes, but like I said, when it comes to adolescence and that formative period in someone's life, that's often the primary demographic for a lot of these sites. So particularly the ones that are seen as being up and coming and seen as the hot properties, those are usually the ones that are appealing to maybe people in their mid or late teens, because that's the kind of trendy one.
Yeah. I'm going to be honest. I sort of forgot about things like TikTok and what are the other ones? Instagram, things like that. I'm mainly thinking in terms of Facebook, but I guess that.
Yeah, it covers everything really. The idea of social media. But granted, a lot of the research that will have been done so far will have covered things like, more specifically, Facebook and Twitter, because those are the things that have been more available going back, whereas TikTok is a relatively new phenomenon. So, the specificities of which kind of platform, we're probably not in a position yet to know too specifically whether it makes much difference, whether you're posting, short clips about your life, or whether it's, or like images or 140 character descriptions of what your thoughts are on each individual occasion, etc., etc.
I mean, the reason why I brought up Twitter and Facebook specifically is because those are like the primary discussion sites, even though obviously Twitter is absolutely terrible for debate just because based solely on its format. I brought those up because I feel that those are kind of the more important ones, especially in the spheres we like to operate in, where we like to talk about how things politically shift and everything, and for better and for worse, Facebook and Twitter have kind of become the. I know I sometimes think it's a bit hyperbolic, but they have become kind of the public squares.
In a lot of ways, yeah. But so, I mean, yeah, in a lot of ways, you could probably compare those types of platforms to Hyde Park or something like that. Speaker's Corner, except you have the ability to have your message reach more people than you could ever shout to, which is quite significant in itself. So yeah, describing it as the public square is it comes with a lot of legal connotations if you're thinking about it in those terms, but it's probably quite an accurate description of how communication is actually conducted nowadays. More specifically, though, let's get back onto the original topic, which is, so how do these interact with the community? And just to start that off, I think it's probably relevant to point out that these communities on social media and the kind of opportunities that are opened by social media are helping us to redefine our definition of community and the communities that we consider ourselves a part of. Because it's much easier to get into a super niche place where you would almost never be able to form some kind of regional community on based on some particular characteristic, perhaps. But social media very much makes that possible.
Yeah, I was just about to jump in and keep going with that thought that the social media has replaced, well, not necessarily replaced, but certainly stepped in as a option for a wider, more insular community. Like, it's so much easier on Twitter or Facebook or whatever to find a group of people who think like you do and agree with you, and that you genuinely agree with, whether it be politics or some hobby or whatever, and you form that online community with people that you may never even meet in person, who may not even live in the same country or area as you. Something that is just before social media is just not impossible. You just can't form a community around people that you aren't in physical contact with. It would have been impossible. Your community would have been where you were. You'd have to, go out into the real world and make actual friends.
But do we think that's necessarily a good thing, or do we think that that's necessarily a bad thing? Because I think it could go either way, but especially when you think about things in terms of politics, having these very insular communities that can be quite large. You obviously see on both sides of the aisle, you see a lot of, I suppose put it this way, it's where you get these left and right wing talking points, and they just sort of get shared amongst their local community, and that's all you really hear.
I think it's very much it can go either way kind of thing, where and it's just the issue of these kind of communities in general, and that is it's I feel like the only thing I can really speak of that's in that's something I've got personal experience with is gaming communities and things like this, where anyone who's in a gaming community has noticed or has been in a gaming community since they were quite young, which I was, is the fact that you see these new people coming in, and it's not, and I feel like it's such a weird way to describe it, but I do see them a bit as invaders and not as people who want to actually join the community, because kind of putting my age out there a bit, but back when I was younger, gaming was the video games and stuff like that was an incredibly nerdy thing to do, and it was quite easy to just ostracize the person, because it's like, well, oh, look at this child over here, he's 15 and he's playing Pokemon still, kind of attitude. And so then gamers get called hostile because they don't want people just casually joining them, and it's like, well, it's not because we're trying to be active, it's not because we were trying to be actively hostile at the time, and more just the fact that it's like, we were bullied, and we don't want to get bullied again, so we are going to ask for your credentials, quote-unquote, as a gamer, so that we, can protect ourselves a little bit, and I think that's where communities can run into a lot of problems, because it's like, if you let everybody in and you become too diverse, you will inevitably let in bad actors. If you're too much rigidly into this like old guard mindset, then your community will kind of just stagnate and never grow.
Well, it's levels of exclusivity. So by creating a community, or really a category, you're selecting things that are going to be inside the category and outside the category, or inside the community and outside the community. And it's about the level of, the amount of barriers that you want to put up between people who are inside and outside, because obviously you're having setting up an exclusivity according to games, playing games. If you're not playing games, then you're not a gamer. But if you accept in non-gamers into the gaming community, then you've kind of defeated the point of having it in the first place. And so, yeah, there's, like you said, basically there's pros and cons. I don't know that I necessarily have too much more to add to that, except just to take it in a slightly different direction, because I've got a little bit more experience perhaps with kind of ideological communities and ideas-based communities. It is, well, for a little bit of a history lesson first, interestingly, it's not the first time that this kind of phenomenon has popped up. So going back to the kind of Enlightenment era and the 19th century, there was a lot of this kind of thing as well, where you would get groups of people who were in correspondence with one another. So in the past you'd have, the modern day influencer in the past was the man of letters, as it were, or polemicist or something. There's a lot of words for it, but basically, somebody who would be in correspondence with a lot of people and be respected for their view on various things. And it was very, very much possible to create this kind of insular community of ideologically like-minded people, with various degrees of people being respected within it, and a certain amount of stratification. Obviously, what that leads to in the 19th century is a great deal of political unrest, when some of these groups, like anarchists in particular, are able to make themselves relatively insular and develop in certain directions and develop certain doctrines which allow them to make big plays on the international stage or the national stage in a political sense. So anarchist bomb throwers were quite a significant thing in the late 19th century, because they'd built up this kind of repertoire of knowledge and an ideological doctrine which allowed for basically politics through force, the idea of propaganda through violence. And that was kind of an accepted doctrine that a certain amount of people took them up on. And there's a good chance that because that was a very much a time and place phenomenon, that once you take away that community or you disrupt it somehow, then that phenomenon basically goes away. And so that's quite a significant development in itself. The fact that we're trending more towards that direction of ideological cells and groups which are separate from one another, and we're not all receiving information from the same place, because that's another facet of it as well, is that they all had their own outlets. You'd have like anarchist newspapers, for example, and that would be providing information and world events and politics and such through that particular lens. We're going back in that direction, so we might see, arguably we're already there, that you might see an increasing degree of distance from one another, and completely separate doctrines of conduct.
Yeah, so just remember, if you're in Antifa, you're not special. Everyone else has done it before.
Yep, you're not the first. You can view that in either a positive or a negative sense, but yeah, it's a problem that groups have had to deal with before. And I guess for anyone who is perhaps, I doubt anyone that's a member of Antifa would be watching this, but anybody who knows a member of Antifa, the way that it was dealt with in the past, I suppose, dealt with, so to speak, was by infiltration mostly. So, I don't necessarily trust everyone around you, because some of them might be police informants, effectively.
Yeah, it's coming for your ass.
Yeah.
Just give a survival tip to Antifa.
Yes, it goes for anyone, really, who's trying to form some kind of, cohesive organization. It's relevant to relevant to anyone really, but most relevant to Antifa at the moment because, well, they're one of the resurging groups.
I've seen V for Vendetta over there.
So, yeah, in the modern day, that obviously means that that we are, again, trending in that kind of direction, and we're forming much more of these communities, less based on some kind of national polity and more of an international kind of ideology. That's definitely been a trend in recent times, I would say. The idea of international nationalism, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it actually makes sense if you're moving in the right communities. It's very odd, but the danger, as I think somebody already mentioned, is that this develops into a kind of radicalization, which causes a kind of purity spiral. These are all talking points within these spheres, of course, and something that a lot of people are very very aware of and cautious of. But it is something that's worth bringing up as a facet of this whole conversation. But to speak in favour of this kind of development, it is perhaps noteworthy, just on an anecdotal basis, that the ability to generate meaningful relationships with somebody who you've met on the basis of this kind of shared worldview, I've found to be much more natural. And so being able to, pretty much from the outset, being aware that you share values is something that's very powerful for generating some of those longer term relationships. And I think it's been a pleasant experience, personally. I don't know if you guys have any experience with that kind of thing.
Somewhat. I mean, I tend not to. It's very. Who I am here and who I am elsewhere are very different people, but I do tend to find that I find a lot of people who basically do share the same values as me, and it's always nice to talk to those people, even if we, on certain ideological levels, disagree. It's actually been kind of interesting, but then I'm a weirdo that actively tries to seek out things that are not within an echo chamber, as it were.
Yeah, so it's always nice to get a different perspective, but it's always good to know that you're not kind of treading on eggshells around someone, in terms of not wanting to say the wrong thing. And of course, there's also the ongoing developing element of living in the same reality, even, because the way that things are trending, the different spheres and the different perceptions that people are having, and the events that are drawn attention to different people via different news sources and such, means that we're basically living in completely different versions of reality in a lot of ways at this point. And it's kind of hard to maintain a relationship with somebody when you're not viewing the same version of reality. You're not even aware of the same events. Don't perceive them the same way, even if you do acknowledge the same events.
Yeah, just to go in on that, I mean, I wouldn't consider myself actually to be particularly deep into. I know that I frequently describe myself as being a right winger, but I'm not particularly active in any communities online or offline for that matter. Certainly have circles of friends that I speak with, but that's not quite the same, I think, as a community actively discussing ideas. Anyway, I do know what it's like to speak with and interact with people who are really deep into these communities, like particularly left-wing communities, some old friends and even family members, and it is, as Rupert says, they are operating on a completely different version of reality once they are deep in enough, once they've heard the same talking points enough time, once they've absorbed the rhetoric. They and you are going to be on completely different planes of existence where they won't even accept valid points because they refuse to accept anything that doesn't agree with their pre-established worldview. It can really warp someone. That's probably my my best experience with seeing what communities do to people.
Question then to the floor: Do we think that applies in every community? So even if you're in, say, a geographical community that turns into a kind of subcultural community, just based on that region, if you've got like all the sorts of regional food and regional customs and things, do we think that affects the sense of reality in the same way?
I think it does, because what's the best way to describe this? Well, every community, I think, has its own culture, because everyone does talk about like different things having culture. Like even comic books has a culture. And so I do feel like that must be true, because then you get people who come from Japan, tourists go to France and apparently visit Paris, and apparently they just get really bad culture shock, like it's absolutely terrible for them.
Oh yeah, Paris syndrome, right, or something like that. But
Yes.
yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say that essentially, like you said, with the local communities which you build around people who are actually within arm's length of yourself, those definitely have built their own sort of worldview. Like, it's the whole culture shock thing, where if you go to Japan, the social norms there are completely different. Same as if you go to China or even another Europe, like Germany or France. They certainly build their own. I suppose you could refer to it as a different view of reality. I suppose these political communities end up having a far greater effect on your worldview than your in regards to that kind of thing. I don't really know where I'm going with that anymore.
I mean, I think I can maybe expand on that, and that's when it comes to like different perceptions of reality. It's like I mean, we used to kind of have this, but in the Western world we have the OK hand gesture, which obviously has been a bit demonized. Thank you, 4chan, you absolute mad lads. But I've forgotten where it was, but in another country, the OK symbol actually doesn't mean what you think it means. Apparently, I think it basically means like you're calling someone an asshole.
So, I think it very much depends on what sort of community you're talking about, because we seem to be drawn to this idea of a political communities, and I don't think I agree that your local community will have a vastly different worldview as everyone else. I think on a national level maybe, but that's a level of culture shock, less a level of. I view that as something different. I'll put it that way, because I think that if you look into, say, I don't know, let's keep on with game. If you look into the Animal Crossing community, I very much doubt that they're seeing news or just current events any differently than the Doom Eternal community. I'm picking games out of my hat. You associate whatever random community you want, but I think the main difference in the perception of reality is in the politicized news cycle that you get. So as Rupert was talking about with the anarchist newspapers these days have become the equivalent of that. And I think that it's a very clear divide between left and far left and moderate and right wing.
Well, I'm sorry, are you done, Henry?
Well, I was just going to finish off with, rather than it being... So, yeah, to reiterate, the difference in reality is a political issue rather than a difference in your smaller communities.
Well, I can't help but feel like you've kind of missed the point on this somewhat. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not saying that only. I don't think any of us are saying that only the political communities are what warps your sense of reality, or that every different communities will warp your sense of reality to different degrees and about different things. Like I use the example of politics because we so frequently talk about politics, and it's fresh on my mind, and that's what causes the most derision between me and my friends and family members. It is that when you're in, let's say, like a really far left-wing political community, that's going to completely and utterly warp your view on politics. I can still sit down with that person and have a perfectly reasonable conversation about film or literature, for example. It's warping their view of reality in regard to politics. In the same way, I'm sure if you could go on any like subreddit for, I don't know, go on open like our Xbox and our PlayStation, assuming those exist, probably do, and you'll see that they've got completely different ideas about the gaming landscape at the moment. I'd assume. I don't know. I'm not a console pleb. I don't go on Reddit. But I hope you understand where I'm coming from with this. That it's not just, oh man, I don't think. If you're only interested in Doom Eternal, that's not going to warp your reality. It's well, it's going to warp your perception of reality in a different area to a different degree.
I think to maybe also give maybe a non-politicized example of what affects your people's not only just perception of reality but kind of like reaction to it is the difference between like again I know way too much about Japan. I'm such a weeb. It's a bit like the difference between transport, where if you're on a train in the UK, you do your best to like kind of keep yourself. You would hope that you would keep yourself out of somebody else's personal space, and they would give you the same courtesy. Whereas if you're on a train in Japan and some guy basically falls asleep and he puts his head on your shoulder, whereas in the UK you'd be expected to be like, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" In Japan, it's actually that would actually be considered rude to tell him to wake up and get off you. You're actually meant to let him just sleep. And I think that gives you like a different idea on at least how national communities perceive and react to reality differently.
I think I get what you're saying, but I still don't. I wouldn't view a lot of those as a difference in your perception of reality. So if you, as your example of the X and PS4 communities, they're not. I mean, I might be wrong, but I don't think that they're viewing completely different realities. I think they're just having different opinions. Whereas when you go to so my point is that it is mainly the political aspect where your reality itself is getting warped rather than your opinion of something being changed.
Consider it this way. These people who are arguing in defense of Xbox and PlayStation, their view of reality is so warped that they genuinely think that in 2020 a console is a viable gaming platform.
Wow. All right. Shots fired.
Mm.
Okay, put it this way then. So let's say we divide these into two categories. So there's the category where you have a perception that leads to a certain reaction, and so that comes into the kind of cultural element of the train situation that Simon was laying out. So they're both perceiving the idea that, you know, somebody is falling asleep on you. I guess the difference there is whether it's considered rude or not, but the change in perception comes about, or the major change that Simon was talking about comes about as a result of what you're expected to do in relation to that event that's taken place. Whereas when you're talking about a difference in the perception of reality, I would say it's probably more to do with what events you're paying attention to, what events you're aware of, and thus, you know, it builds into your kind of narrative of what's going on around you. And so by that, in that sense, you get a kind of emotional sense of where the world is going, where it is, and then you'll have, you know, some kind of like greater perception on reality from that point. So, for example, it becomes, like you said, more clear-cut when you're talking about ideological communities, because if you are in one of these, you know, left-wing communities where you're talking about things in terms of how everyone's racist and, you know, filtering through a lens of all of these horrendous things that white people are doing to non-white people, then you're going to get a very distinct sense about what the actual nature and trajectory of the country is, and that'll give you a certain emotional layer over your reality that is going to make you a lot more hostile to certain groups of people who you perceive as taking part in some of these activities. Whereas if you're not in that community, then you're going to have a very different emotional sense of where the world is, where it's going, and what your reaction to it should be. And
yeah,
so I think... Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to expand or bring that back to what Simon was saying, in that there are differences on your local level based on your emotional state, on your emotional view of what's going on around you in the same country. But when you expand it out to looking at and comparing, say, for example, England and Japan, the differences there are that the realities are actually different because they are very different places and different cultures.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. I think Rupert's more hit the nail on the head there, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to take this back to the local example, because I think that is a valid instance of your sense of reality being changed, because if only because of the almost necessary relationship that you're going to have with events that are closer to you. And so just because you have that greater knowledge and sense of the events that are taking place in your immediate vicinity. Let's say you receive, some kind of newsletter or newspaper that is local to your town or your small little region, then that changes your sense of what's around you compared to a more general view of what is going on in perhaps the adjacent town that you don't get as much detailed information on, or perhaps even the nation at large, because the information that you're receiving there is so much more filtered by whatever news agencies, and so you only get that filtered sense of the most high impact and newsworthy items that are coming from that central news agency, and of course whatever they decide to report on, which may or may not have anything to do with the objective state of what is most impactful going on, but that's let's leave that aside. Would you say that qualifies then, Henry?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very good point, because to expand and maybe help myself understand a bit more, I think it goes into this idea of what you perceive yourself and what you perceive in your local community is a lot more concrete than these things further away, because the information that you're getting from further away is usually filtered through, if not news agencies, filtered by who is telling you the story or things like that. And again, filtered by what's interesting. Like, you're not being told about what's going on in Scotland about some guy eating haggis. Whereas, if you're in your local community, you might be sent a picture or it might be a topic of discussion that someone makes some really good food, just as an example, which wouldn't translate further afield because it's just not really worth the time.
I mean, that's another quick thing to bring up, actually, that's interesting about this whole conversation, is that if we are talking about, so let's say that the central media agency is entirely rational and is purely mechanically looking at the most important events that are taking place. We humans tend to have a filtering towards negative events, and so just by viewing things in that national sense rather than the local sense, we'll be getting a more negative version of what's happening in the country, which is kind of an interesting thing that's just come to my mind. Because when you're getting the local news stories, it's more likely to be filled out with positive stories because they need to fill out space or whatever else. And whereas when they've got so many more events to deal with at a national level, they're going to filter more towards the negative events because the negative events draw the most attention.
And it's because of this sort of filter that I do have to, is why I stress what I stress, which is just try and get your information from as many sources as possible, because everyone has their own filter and their own way of passing information. So do your best to get multiple interpretations of the same source, because you'll probably never find the primary source, because the world sucks that way.
Yeah, trying to chase primary sources constantly is going to be a very time-consuming task. But, it does also imply the recommendation that you look more into the events of your locality, because you're more likely to get a more positive, rosy view of what's going on around you, which by extension would probably be a fuller view, if we're going to ignore biases in those particular media outlets for a moment. So yeah, try and get more local news. It might make you more optimistic about what's going on around you. But actually, if we were to bring this back around to the personal aspect, this comes back in this whole perception sense, in this whole perception thing, and not getting our views locally and instead filtering through this more ideological framework, or perhaps even just the remote communities framework, even if it's not an ideological one. That's going to be changing our perception in the negative to the world around us, just because, again, if we're using more if we're investing less time into looking into what's going on around us and using less and requiring less information, either because we're letting another agency filter it for us, or because we are allowing it to be filtered by one of these social media sources or something, then we're not getting as full of a picture of things as we perhaps could be getting. And it's going to be typically filtered in the negative, either for our own mental health, because other people are filtering things for us, to make them to present the best version of themselves in the case of social media, or in the negative for the perception of society, because negative stories tend to be reported to the low effort or via the low effort news sources. And so, that might go some way towards explaining why people have been generally seeming to get more unhappy over time.
Yeah, to that point of people getting more unhappy over time and everything like that. The main reason why I suggested this talk in particular was because as things have been trending towards more these insular communities popping up, and it seems to be having a very, and I say insular communities as in the ones that appear online, be it in your subreddits, Twitter echo chambers, Facebook, etc., is the fact that it seems to be causing a degrading and corrosive effect on everything that happens in the real world, as it were. At least that's my perception of it. And so my question is there a real way to recover this? Because obviously you do also have even the most standard person who maybe isn't, maybe they're not even really that partisan, they're very much just a moderate who votes the way they feel like it kind of situation, and they feel probably less and less empowered to make an active change on anything and stuff like that. And I feel like it all is starting to promote pessimism and tribalism, and is kind of maybe almost destroying the fabric of healthy communities that we have. And so my question then would be, is there any real way to pull it back from that kind of brink, or is this just a case of everything will have to just be burnt down and we restart?
Well, I'll start then briefly, because I think that allows me to expand on something I just said that needs a little bit of expansion. So when I talked about the idea of getting more information from more localized sources, I'm including things like the way that you communicate, and the fact that, for example, if you're communicating via text, then an enormous amount of the information that you would ordinarily be conveying is lost because you're not able to use your body language to convey additional information that you would otherwise. So just having a conversation with somebody face to face is obviously one of the ways of conveying the maximum amount of information, and that is almost certainly what we are evolved to, the way that we are evolved to communicate. And we end up, gesturing a lot, which brings across a lot of, using facial expressions in order to convey more of what we mean. And so I think that is one of the ways that we could bring it back, because I think what we would quite quickly find if we were to revert to something more like a geographical or regional sense of community, then we would be able to bridge some of that gulf much more easily if we can understand that the people who we are viewing as opposing to us may not, there may not necessarily be as big of a gulf there as we think there is. Maybe I'm overly optimistic in this regard, but I do think that in a lot of cases we have similar priorities, but if you're only receiving that through a meme, then you get a very warped sense of what that person's actual beliefs are. And so I've had the case in the past where I've had a certain perception of somebody because of a meme that they've shared, and it implies that they hold a certain set of views. And then when I actually speak to them about it, it turns out that they just basically just agreed with one part of it, but hadn't really thought too much about the rest of it. And so when you start to go into those kinds of details, then you find that there's actually a lot more common ground than you would initially think. And I think that's probably going to... So there's that, but there's also the element of people who have a low investment in whatever they think, in that kind of ideological community, and they're receiving much more in the way of the human physiological needs that are satisfied by community. And so if you can replace that with something else, then that plays a part as well. So I think that in a lot of these cases, people have a relatively low investment in some of these communities, and thus it would be easily substituted out by something else, and you'd be able to bridge that gap a lot easier if, again, we could be having face-to-face communication, face-to-face talks with people, and communicate with people on a one-to-one basis, or even again just in person, so that you can convey more of that information. He says in a very contradictory manner because he's talking to 3 other people via a screen.
I was also going to say it's a good thing that we can all go out and hug each other these days. Go out and have lots of face-to-face conversations.
Oh yeah, it'd be really tragic if that was cut off for about 3 to 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like what you're kind of getting at is the idea of people sometimes just need a reminder of each other's humanity sometimes.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an issue about I wouldn't say it's about social media itself, because as Rupert was saying earlier, it's been done before via newsletters and letter writing. But just this idea of anonymity, is that the right word? I don't know. Over the internet and yeah, and not getting a full view of someone's view.
Yeah, it's really hard to. So as I was trying to explain with my example, and feel free to contradict me if this is what you're referring to, but when somebody is sharing a meme or something, then even if you don't know how much they buy into each individual point that's being conveyed by the meme. So there's the subtext and the, if this is a word, overtext. So there's the explicit part of the meme and the more subtle part of the meme that is sort of diverting thought in certain directions. And when they share the meme, they're conveying all of that as though they agree with it. Whereas it's quite possible that they thought one part of it was relevant and decided to share it on that basis.
Are you trying to tell me that stranger on the internet wasn't actually a JoJo fan?
Perhaps.
So, yeah, I think I do agree with you. And I think in general it would be better to... what's the word? Yeah, to communicate in more personal ways. I think that's something that we should definitely be doing more as a society, but I think it's something that we're being trained out of more and more, it seems. So it may be that, people get sick of talking over the internet and over coronavirus, and suddenly there's this big burst of people going, okay, let's meet up in person because I don't want to talk to you on the phone anymore. I'd rather drive up to you and actually meet you. And I think there's more to talk about, but I think another important factor is the level of investment that you have in your community that you're portraying by taking part in certain things. So you use the example of a meme, and to take it back to the political side, I think it is... Well, okay, I'll put it this way. As members of the right side of the aisle, which I believe we'll self-describe as, or at least leaning in that direction, how many times have you heard, say, for example, referring to the current Prime Minister as Bozo rather than Bojo, or any variation of Orange Man Bad? It's very low effort. It's very, you don't need to be very into the community to be like, ha ha ha, Trump is bad, Boris Johnson is not doing well. That, as someone who voted Conservative in the last election, it paints the person as more of an opposition than they necessarily are.
I thought the whole Orange Man Bad thing was kind of more of our side of the political spectrum's kind of like meme perception of the left wing.
Yeah, I know, but I mean the actual what they say Orange Man Bad, rather than the meme Orange Man Bad when they say like, oh well, Trump. What's an example? Trump taking kids away from their families for no reason and putting them in prison. When, well, actually, there's very good reasons for that. You can explain it, and not really that big of a deal, and it's something that has been going on for a while. It's little things like little tidbits that they don't bother looking into. They don't really think about it. They just see the headline, and obviously you get the same on the right. Obviously, like everyone, it's easy to do. You see a headline, you just sort of can't be bothered. You don't have time scrolling through. Yeah. It's easy enough just to read your headline and take it at face value.
I will fully admit that I have done that a few times and then had to go back and actually look more into it.
Yeah, of course. Everyone has. It's easily done.
All right, Kurtz, if you've got anything to add, I think we're pretty much ready to wrap up.
I don't really think there's anything to add on to what we've already said. Yeah, I think we've covered pretty much everything I was hoping to talk about at the very least.
Well, just to put a final full stop on it, on my point, I think it is, well, I mean, I said this earlier, but I am generally quite hopeful that we can, bring things back. To your point, Henry, you did mention that it's not a new thing. However, it was not quite the case in the past that the newspapers, the anarchist newspapers and such, and all of those ideological communities were quite so, I don't know, scientifically designed to grab your attention and keep your attention and not let go. That is quite an insidious element that is quite new. You know, the data manipulation and all the intelligence and such that goes into trying to retain people's attention is something that is definitely an innovation. But yeah, we can still. I think we can still come back from it if we recognize it, and hopefully, when the pubs open up again, we can all get back to cafes, having a conversation over a nice cup of tea, and good old chat by the fire with a pint.
Wait, a cafe or a pub?
Both simultaneously.
Very nice. So, go on, Simon.
Just to also finish my point, I am basically in the same mindset as Rupert, where I am feeling more positive about things, and speaking as someone who has felt kind of like genuinely disaffected, like I feel like I have so little agency and power in the world. To anyone who feels that way now, I can give you some anecdotal advice, take it or leave it, and that is get involved in your local community somehow, even if it's just charity work and things, and even if it's, and never think of something like beneath you, like even being a volunteer litter picker or something will actually help, because it's just nice to have your local area look nice. It helps improve everybody's morale, as it were. And it can make you feel like you are making some difference. It's not going to be world-changing or anything, but it's going to be enough to make you feel like you're having some sort of positive effect, and I think that's very important to your mental health.
Yeah, I think that's something to try. It's not something I've done personally, and I think, well, I hope you're right, I'll put it that way. But this is something that we can come back from, because the more I let's put it this way, for most of my life, it's been getting more and more insular, more and more on your global community, your online communities, rather than your local. I think that's something that we seem to have lost. So I know, at least where I live, you don't really talk to your neighbours. You just sort of sit inside or drive to work, talk to whatever friends you want. You meet up with, that sort of thing. You don't really have or at least here we don't really have that much of a community, which would be good to get back at some point.
Yeah, well, just because we can come back doesn't necessarily mean that we will, of course.
Yeah.
She just thought that I wanted to add that as someone who has spent a lot of time over the years speaking to people through screens, it is not the same connection you get speaking to people in person. There is an element there, and I don't know, maybe it is the interpretation of eyebrow wiggles and hand gestures is really adding something, but it's a much more fulfilling experience to try and foster that local community that these online communities really are lacking in that element of fulfillment. So, and to add to what Rupert and Simon were saying, yeah, I hopefully when coronavirus lockdown is over, hopefully everyone will just be so happy to be able to go out and meet up in person that's going to be a big boon, and everyone's going to be skipping through the parks holding hands once more.
Just make sure you've washed them first. Also, body language makes Unga Brain happy.
Alright, on that note, return to Monkey. Bye, everyone.